Hi, welcome to this crash course. In this crash course, we are going to be learning how to use JavaScript. Now, just a quick disclaimer, we're not actually going to be learning how to link it into our websites because that's a whole separate topic on its own. It's quite complicated and there's a lot of different stuff that we need to use. So in this video, we're going to be solely focused on vanilla JavaScript, just the standard, how to work with the programming language, and then in a future crash course, we'll be learning how to link it into our websites. So let's get started. The first thing I want to talk about is what JavaScript actually is. So pretty much just like you have Python or Java that is used to compile programs on the computer or run them, JavaScript is pretty much the programming language of the web. If you find pretty much any website out there today, it's going to be using some JavaScript. Now this could be on the front end, this could be used to, move things around or change things for the user, but it can also be used on the back end to, for example, store user details or run some complicated server-side processing. So JavaScript can pretty much have endless, uses and possibilities, and whatever you do on the web, you're going to need to use JavaScript. So that's what we're going to be learning in this video. So the first thing I want to do is go ahead and talk about this window that we have up here. So because it's running on the web, we're going to need a way to see it through the web. And Chrome actually has a really nice console that we can use to view our JavaScript code. So if you just go ahead, right click, and click Inspect, and then go to Console, it's going to bring up this window. But you can also use Control or Command Shift J, and it will open up the window as well. Now, just a quick note, you do need to be on Chrome to use this, so if you're using Safari or Firefox or a different browser, you're going to have to find another workaround, so I recommend you go ahead and install Chrome now if you don't have it. So, first of all, I'm just going to run some pretty basic stuff here. Now, we don't need to know what this is yet, but pretty much you can see I can write pretty valid code, click enter, and it will print everything out for me just as I expect it. So there we go. Now let's go ahead and start working on learning how to use JavaScript. So before we actually write anything, we need to create and link a file because we can't just write it directly into our HTML document. We need to create a separate file. We need to go ahead and then use this file to write our code. So first of all, if you don't already know, I'm using Sublime Text, which is a text editor. I will link it in the description if you want to download it. So let's go ahead and get started. The first thing I'm going to do is create a new file using Control N. If you're on Mac, you can use Command N. Then I'm going to use Control or Command S to save. And I'm going to go ahead and save this as, let's just call it script for now. Now, the file extension for JavaScript files is .js. So make sure you save it as that, otherwise it won't run properly. So we're going to save it, and there we go. We have our file. So the next thing I want to do is link it to our HTML document. Now we need to use a special tag for this, and if you don't already know how to use HTML, I have a crash course on it that you can view on my YouTube channel. So you can go ahead and view that if you don't already know how to use it. Now the HTML is going to be minimal in this video, so you don't really need to cover it all, but it is helpful to know a little bit about tags. So what I'm going to do at the bottom of the body, so right before the closing body tag, I'm going to create a script tag. So if you're in Sublime Text, you can type out the name of the tag and then click, tab, and there you go. You have your tag right there. But if you want, you can type it out manually. So let's go ahead and get started. I am going to enter the type, which in this case is going to be JavaScript. So the way you do that is through text/JavaScript, just like that. And the next thing you want to do is actually link to the location of your file. So you can do this using source or src. Now, if you don't already know, these are called attributes. They're ways to pretty much give extra information to the tag. So under src or source, you're going to type the location of the file. Now, first thing I want to do is actually refresh the folders. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that so you can see it. Now you can see that they're in the same folder. So I'm going to use / since they're both in the same place. And then the name. Make sure to use the full file name, including the extension. So there we go. Script, we have our type, and then we also have our source. Now we have it linked, but how are we supposed to test how it works? Well, just like I showed you before, when I ran some code here, it printed it to our console. The same thing happens here. Since it's rendering the HTML page, it's also going to run whatever's in here. So the easiest way to test how it works is just type something out. And if it runs perfectly, then it has linked. So let's go ahead and type something. Now, like I said, you don't need to know what this means. I'm just going to say test from the JS file. So I'm going to save it using Control or Command S. Now I'm going to go ahead and refresh my page, and hopefully it should have linked properly. There you go. It says test from the JS file, and it also gives you the location of where this is from, which is our file that we just created. So there we go. Now we know that our file works. So now we've covered all of that, let's start talking about JavaScript and what we can do with it. So in JavaScript, there are these things called data types, which are pretty much different ways of representing data. So I'm going to go over the main ones in this video. So the first one are numbers. This is the most primary, the most basic version of a data type. So for example, the number 0 or 1 or 2 or pretty much any number that you enter into here, right? It's going to be, I'm actually going to create a comment. I'll talk about comments in a second. So pretty much anything here is going to be you're going to be able to do arithmetic on them. So for example, you can actually say 2 plus 2 with the operator there. And when I go ahead and refresh, you can see, well, it doesn't say anything because I need to log it to the console. But once I log it, you're going to see that it says 4. So you can run pretty much basic arithmetic, you can do operations with numbers, and you can pretty much operate on them just like you would with a normal number. But there's also another data type, and it's called a string. So I'm going to go ahead and create a comment here. So what are strings? Think of them as words or characters. Just like you can work with numbers to create new numbers, maybe run addition, subtraction, any arithmetic operation, you can use strings to create words or glue characters together. So in order to create a string, you need to use speech marks like this. So once you use those speech marks, you can put pretty much whatever you want inside them. So I can put 2, I can put a, I can put any character I want, and that will be considered a string. Now let's go ahead and talk about some of the differences between strings and numbers. Let's go ahead and type out 2 plus 2 again, but this time we're going to put it inside a string and log it to the console. Let's go ahead and refresh and see what happens. You can see that instead of the number 4, we get 2 plus 2. So that's one thing to note when you're using strings. This is treated like a word or a character. Instead of being treated like a number where you can add and subtract, this is instead treated like a list or glued together characters which you can move around. Now, what if I go ahead and do 2 plus the string 2? What will it give us? Do you think it'll give us the string 4? Well, actually, it's pretty interesting. It gives us 22. Now, this is something about strings. When you add them together, you're pretty much just gluing them together to create one new string. So instead of before when I had 2 plus 2, and that gave me 4, I now put together the characters 2 and 2, which gives me 22. So that's one thing to note, is that you cannot run mathematical operations with strings. They're more used for words, characters, pretty much just text. So let's talk about the next two data types, which are called booleans. Now, if you don't know what a boolean is, pretty much it's just it's used for conditionals, which we're going to learn later here, but think of it as just true and false. Now, you just type them out like that with without any quotation marks, just like that, true and false, and these are not strings, they're not words. They're considered their own data type. So true and false are used pretty much constantly throughout JavaScript. They're used to differentiate between something, and also it's used a lot in conditional logic. So for example, if you want to check if a user's username is equal to the one stored in the database, you can return true and false values. Now, we'll talk more about booleans and how to use them later because it's quite hard to explain out of context. So once we get to if statements and more complex stuff in this video, we'll start talking about why you would use booleans later. Now, if we print console.log true versus something like console.log the word true, so I'll go ahead and show you that. So we're console.logging true versus the string. I'll refresh the page and you can see that there's actually different highlights, and that's because just to show you that Booleans are a completely different data type from words. So there we go. That's pretty much it for Booleans. Now let's talk about the next two data types, null and undefined. So I'm going to say null and undefined. So you can, first of all, if I just go ahead and let me just type something here, for example. So I'm going to say console.log the number or the string a, right? Now you can actually see something here and it says they're undefined. Now this is its own data type completely. This isn't like a word or a Boolean or a number. This is its own thing. Now what is undefined? Well, pretty much, let's just say you're trying to get the username of someone. So you're trying to find someone's username in a database. You make a search for this user and this user's username. However, if you don't actually find it, let's just say that your function gives you back undefined. So undefined is pretty much saying there's no specifically defined value. Now, of course, this doesn't make sense out of context, but going back to our little username finder, when it says undefined, it's pretty much saying there's no explicitly set result from the function. Now there's also another one which is called null. Now null is a little bit different because instead of undefined, which is just not set, where you don't have a set value, null is saying that there is explicitly nothing. It's not that there is no defined value, is that there is a defined value and it's nothing. So we don't really see null that commonly here, but if you start writing more complex functions, null becomes very useful. So there we go. Those are pretty much the basic data types in JavaScript. But how do we actually start using them? So this is where we start getting into variables. So let's go ahead and get started. Now let's say I wanted to create a number. So I'm going to say, for example, my age. Now, let's just say my age for now is 40. Now, I want this program every time it hits my birthday to increase by 1 and then print out my age. Now, let's just say we're using a normal number. So let's just say now it's my 41st birthday and I'm going to console.log 41. And that works perfectly. But what happens when it hits the next birthday? Am I just going to go inside and change this to 42 or 43? How am I supposed to calculate this without updating the file? This is where variables come in. Now, pretty much variables are a way of tracking and manipulating your data. So, for example, let's just say I wanted to, back to my birthday example, print my new age every birthday. What I would do is create a variable, which think of it as a box, which stores my age as a number. Then later on, I can actually change the box and what's inside it without actually having to change every instance of the number. And then later on, I could print my age without having to clearly go into the script and change it from 41 to 42. Instead, I can just say print age. So let's go ahead and get started with defining these variables. So pretty much the standard way of typing or defining a variable is using var. Now there's some other keywords for this, but var is for variable, and we're going to stick with this for now. The name of your variable, and remember, although this is a word, you don't actually put it in quotation marks because it's not a string, it's a whole new thing. So let's just say, for example, age equals, and then whatever you want. Using the data types from before, you can put whatever you want in here. True, null, pretty much anything that you want to put in here, you can. For now, I'm going to put the number 40. So let's go ahead and see what happens when I say age plus 40. Age plus 1. When we console.log this, I'll refresh it, it says 41. This is because what it's taking is that little box, taking whatever's inside that box, which in this case is the number 40, and adding 1 to it. Now, what if we wanted to change what's inside our box? How are we supposed to do that? Well, luckily for us, it's actually very simple. All we have to do is reference the variable again using its name. So in this case, age. Then we're going to set it to something new. So for example, let's go ahead and say 41. Now let's console.log age without the +1 and see what happens. It still says 41. So you can notice that we don't actually have that var keyword anymore. And this is pretty much because it's already been declared or created. We don't need to do it again since all we're doing is changing the value inside. Now, obviously, we're still going to have to go in and change the number every birthday. So how do we fix this? What we can do is simply add 1 to the current age. So for example, I can say age is equal to age plus 1. What this is doing is taking the current age, adding 1 to it, and then resetting it. So every birthday, it will just reset like that. Let's go ahead and console.log age again, and you can see it still gives us 41. Now, instead of typing this whole thing out, there's actually a much easier way to do it. We can say age plus equals 1. And what this is pretty much saying is add 1 to itself. Now, we don't have to set this to 1. We can set it to 10. So if I refresh there, it says 50. And you can do whatever. You can even say age plus equals age. And that's going to give us 80. So this introduces us to the next set of operators here. Instead of just using the equal sign, you can use pretty much whatever mathematical operator you want and work with it. So for example, minus equals will subtract the age. This should give us 0. You can also multiply the age by itself, just like that. You can see that works. And you can also divide using the slash. And you can see that works there. Now, this doesn't just have to be with numbers. You can also work with strings. Let's go ahead and talk about that. So for example, name, and I'm just going to put John for now. Now, what if I wanted to add ny to the end of it? I'm going to see age plus equals the string ny. Look what happens when we console.log it, making sure to change the variable name. Just like that. Name. Now let's console.log it and see what happens. It prints out Johnny. Now notice how there's no space in between John and ny. This is because JavaScript does not create the spaces for you. If you want to make them, you have to put them in yourself. Let's just say I wanted to create a last name. What I would have to do is put space and then the last name. I refresh and it works. But if I just put it without the if I just put it without the space, it'll just connect them together like that. So make sure that you keep that in mind. So there we go. That's pretty much it for variables and these operators. Now let's talk about some more complicated things. So we have our variables and we have our basic data types, but now we're going to start covering data structures. So data structures are a little bit more complicated because they actually can store data using these basic data types. So the first one we're going to be talking about are arrays. So what are arrays? Now, if you've used any other programming language before, you probably know what arrays are, but pretty much if you don't know, they're just lists or ordered lists of items. So for example, let's just say I wanted to store the names of 1,000 patients in a clinic. What I could do is create an array and store all of those names ordered. So for example, if I wanted to access the name of the 50th patient, I could use some code, which we're going to learn in just a second, to get that name back. So how do we actually create arrays? So I'm going to say var patient names, because remember, we're just storing it to a variable, nothing has changed. The way you can declare an array is using these square brackets just like that. Make sure to put the equal sign. So by doing this, you have created an array. Now, right now it's empty. There's nothing inside of it. But we can actually start putting names in here. So let's go ahead and do that. First name I want to put is John, right? Now, how do I add another name? Well, all you have to do is put a comma and then enter the next. Doe, comma, Jane, and you can do this pretty much as long as for as many items as you want. So you can see John Doe, Jane Doe. And once you're finished, you just finish off with the commas. So that's for creating arrays. Now that we've done it, why don't we actually go ahead and console.log our results. Which, if you don't already know already, prints to the console. You can see that we get this nice little drop down and we can view everything inside here. So what I'm going to be doing here is talking about these numbers. So you can see that each value is assigned a number, 0, 1, 2, and 3. and there's also a length and some other stuff that we don't need to worry about for now. So what are these numbers? Well, when I was talking about arrays, I said that they were in an ordered list. You could access each name based on a number. So everything has an index or a position in the array which you can loop through to get whatever you want. So for example, if I wanted to access the first patient, I could use this number to get it. Now, how do we actually get some value of this? Well, first of all, you're going to take the variable or the array, or the array or the variable storing that array, and then you're going to put square brackets after it. Here, you're going to input that number. Now, it's important to keep in mind that these numbers start at 0. So for example, the first patient would start with have an index or a position of 0. So what I could do is input that number, in this case 0, and now if I go ahead and refresh the page, it prints John. Now, let's go ahead and print that array again because there's another value that we care about, which is length. Now you can see that although the highest index or position is 3, the length is 4. So that's pretty important to keep in mind. The indexes start from 0, but the length starts from 1. If you want to access the length, you can just go dot and then length. We're going to talk about these little dots later. So if I refresh, it gives us 4. So there we go. That's pretty much it for accessing arrays. It's pretty easy. But what if we want to actually manipulate these arrays? So let's say, for example, I wanted to remove the first element. Well, this is where our 4 array methods come in. Push, pop, unshift, and shift. Now, these are a little bit hard to wrap your head around, so I'll give some analogies for you to understand where to use each one. So the first thing we're going to be talking about is unshifting and shifting. So I'm going to type out patient names dot unshift, and then we're going to type in whatever we want. So I'm going to say dough. Now what I'm going to do is refresh the page and, got the console.log. So I'm going to refresh the page and we're going to see what our new array looks like. Let's go ahead and refresh. You can see that dough has been added to the beginning. So I know it sounds a little weird, especially because it says unshift, considering that it should be shifting it, but we're going to talk about the next one and then we can wrap all of this around our heads. So you use unshift to put something at the beginning. Now let's go ahead and talk about removing from the beginning. You can use the method shift. Just like unshift adds to the beginning, shift will remove from the beginning. And in this case, you don't actually have to specify whatever you want to insert. All you have to do is type in .shift and then put parentheses around it, and it will run it for you. Now, it's a little bit complicated, especially with these parentheses and the dots, but we're going to talk about that once we get to functions. Just know that to run this mechanism, you have to use parentheses to specify that you want to run it. Let's go ahead and refresh, see what happens. It should give us our normal array back. There we go. Now, let's talk about push and pop. Just like unshift and shift are used to add and remove from the beginning, push and pop are used for the end. So this one is pretty easy to wrap your head around. Push is just going to add something to the end, and pop is going to remove it from the end. So let's go ahead and push another dough onto the end, right? And then we're going to console.log it. Now let's go ahead and refresh and see what happens. Now you can see that instead of putting the dough at the beginning, it's been put at the end. Now we're going to do the same here and just pretty much cancel it out using pop. Patient names dot pop and then dough. Or actually in this case, sorry, like I said, you don't need to specify anything if you're trying to delete, since it's already just going to delete something. Let's go ahead now and console.log our patient names. Just like before, it returns to normal. So those are the 4 methods: unshift and shift for adding and removing from the beginning, and then push and pop for adding and removing from the end. So there we go. Those are pretty much the basic array methods that you can use. Now there's a lot more out there. You can go ahead and do a quick Google search and you'll find tens of them. There are so many and they all do really special things, but these are pretty much the 4 basic ones that you're going to need to use constantly when you're working with arrays. So there we go. Now we've talked about patient names, arrays. Now let's talk about the next data structure, which is objects. So objects are a little bit more complicated. Now, there isn't much to objects or many indexes or orders, and they are kind of similar to arrays in a way, since they store multiple values. But there are some key differences. So first of all, we're going to talk about those differences in a second, but let's go ahead and create our object. So first thing I'm going to do is type out, for example, a user profile. So I'm going to say var profile. And then I'm going to create this profile using curly brackets instead of square brackets. So now we're going to go ahead and start putting things in our objects. But before we do that, we need to actually understand what an object is. Pretty much an object is also used to store values, but there's no order to it. It's not put in an ordered list, kind of like we have here. Instead, think of it as a bunch of floating values just moving around in our variable. Now, the way you can access these is by using something called a key. So each value is assigned a key, which is a special word, and you can use this key to get the value at any time. Remember, you don't have to use a number or an index, you can just use it to get this key. So an example of this is before, when we had our array and we used that dot length, we were kind of getting something from this unordered mess, which is the object, and then that length is assigned value 4. So let's go ahead and start making or creating this object. Now we want our profile just to have a username and a password. So the way you create key value pairs, which is just think of it as a key and a value assigned together, is by first typing out the key. So for example, username. And this again does not have to be a string, it's a special thing on its own. And notice here that you put a colon and not an equal sign. If you put an equal sign, it's not going to work, it has to be a colon. And then you're going to put whatever you want here. So this can be a string or a number, just like our array. So I'm going to say John Doe, and then you put a comma in there to indicate that you want another value. Then I'm going to put the password. Again, colon, pass, 123. There we go. We've created our profile. So let's go ahead and refresh the page. Oh, whoops. And of course, nothing happens since we're not console.logging anything. But the fact that no errors have been given means that we have successfully created our profile. Now let's talk about accessing some of these values. So before, we used a number system or an index system to access things from an array, where each value is given a certain position. Here, it's a little bit different. You can't really go and just use some random number and get the position, because there are no positions in here. Instead, you use the key which we created here to access the value. So first of all, I'm going to create a console.log here, and let's say we wanted to log the password to the console. That would be a very bad idea, and you shouldn't do that, but let's just say for this example that you wanted to do it. All you have to do is type in the name of the variable that's storing the object. Now it doesn't have to be a variable, it can just be an object declared explicitly. So you can go just like that. But in this case, we want to use our variable dot, and then we're going to type in the key that we want here. So in this case, we want username, just like that, password. So you can see that the dot is used to get something from an object. Let's go ahead and refresh and see what happens. We get pass 123. Now there's actually another way to access these. Just like with the array, you can use square brackets, and then inside you can type a string that contains the name of the key, like this, password. Now let's refresh, we still get pass 123. Now you do have to use a string to get this, to get our key here, versus when you just use a dot operator and you can just type out the name without having to use a string. But again, whichever way you prefer. Now, of course, once you get into later JavaScript, there are some, direct benefits to using, square brackets versus this. But for now, we don't really mind that. So there we go. That's how we can access properties from our objects. Now, this is pretty much it for objects. There's not really much to talk about, but they are very useful and you can use them later on. Now, once we get to the function section of this crash course, we're actually going to talk a little bit more about how to use objects and actually inserting special things into them, which can really improve their benefit. So now we're going to be talking about some more logic-based things in JavaScript. We're actually going to start writing stuff that can run code. So the first thing I'm going to talk about are if statements. So if statements are pretty much a way to check if something is true or false at its core. You can then use this to run certain things depending on the outcome of your situation. Let's go ahead and get started with this. So let's just say that I'm going to have an age here and I'm going to set it to 10 for now. Now what I want to do is pretty much just console.log entry our access granted if the age is greater than 18. Now what we're going to do is pretty much just write this if statement and it's going to run this whole thing for us. Now the way to write if statements is using if and then in parentheses you can type out your condition. Now we're going to leave the condition blank for now, but pretty much what I'm going to talk about is just the if else if structure. Now don't worry about that, but pretty much is going to check whatever's in here, condition, right? So it checks this condition and then it's going to run if true. So if this condition is evaluated to be true, which is a Boolean, remember from before, it's going to run whatever's in here. So now I'm going to be talking about some of the other conditional statements that you can use. There's also else if, which pretty much it's going to check this, and it's also going to check this if our if statement here returned false. So if it wasn't true, then it's going to move on to the next one here. So I'm going to type in else if, and then you can do the same thing as before. And then you can pretty much write as many else ifs as you want. Else if, you can do this as many times as you want. And then finally, you have an else statement. So pretty much what this is going to do is if everything up here did not work and, you don't need parentheses. If everything up here didn't run or nothing worked, pretty much the else statement is just going to run it if this up here didn't work. So you might be wondering what's the difference between using an if statement with a bunch of else ifs and just running a bunch of if statements. Now, the difference is pretty clear. If you write it like this, all of these are connected. So for example, if this if statement is true, everything below here will not run because it's already true. But if you just use a bunch of if statements like this, what's going to happen is it's going to run all of them regardless of whether they're true or not. So that's, of course, it's situation specific. Sometimes you might want to use it and sometimes you don't really need it and it's pretty much useless for the situation at hand. But let's start actually creating some if statements. So we use these things called conditional operators. So just like plus, minus, and divider operators, there's actually special operators for checking these if statements. So first thing I'm going to check is pretty basic. I'm just going to say if 10 is greater than 18. Now this is going to evaluate to true or false. It's going to break down just like how you had numbers 2 plus 2 evaluates as 4. If you use a conditional operator, this is going to evaluate to true or false. And this is the real power of Booleans. This is where they come in. Just like how numbers come in handy when you're trying to do arithmetic, Booleans come in handy when you do conditional logic like this. So if 10 is greater than 18, which is obviously not true, so this will evaluate to false, which means this thing right here wouldn't run. There's also greater than or equal, so you just put an equal sign after that. If 10 is greater than or equal to 18, so if you don't already know, the main difference is that greater than or equal will also check or will also be true if the two values are equal, whereas greater than will not take that into account. There's also the same on the flip side with less than or equal. So of course, both less than and less than or equal will evaluate to true here. So those are the two main ones, and we also have a few more, which we're going to cover later, but then you also have our equality operators, which is triple equals and double equals. So the main difference between these is double equals won't regard for the data type. So for example, if I had 10 is double equal to 10, this will actually be true even though it's a string versus a number. However, if I put a triple equals here, this is going to return false because they're different data types. Now, I recommend strictly sticking to triple equals unless you have a special case in which you want to use it. And of course, that is pretty rare, but like I said, everything is subject specific, but it is kind of dangerous to use the double equals, especially if you can run something that's true when it's not. That can really cause problems in more complex programs. So let's go ahead and get this set up. I want to say if age is greater than or equal to 18, and remember, because we want 18 and above, and then we're going to run something in these curly braces. So in here is where you put whenever you want to run. So I'm going to say console.log entry granted. Now I'm going to create an else statement. So this is pretty much going to run if this here failed, console.log access denied. Just like that. So our age is equal to 10. Let's go ahead and refresh and see what happens. It says access denied. What if we change this to 18, refresh, it says entry granted. So of course, this here isn't really powerful. Now, let's say we wanted to have a whitelist or a certain person that we didn't want to let in. For example, let's go ahead and say a person called John is blacklisted from our little club here. So what I'm going to do is create a new variable, which is going to say John. Now, pretty much, I want to be able to check if John is the name of the person entering. So what I'm going to do is use something called an AND operator, right? So you put two ampersand symbols there, and you're going to say name is equal to John. Or sorry, triple equals. So what this is going to do is it's only going to be true if both of these are true at the same time. So if the age is greater than 18 and the name is equal to John, this is going to be equal to true. Now, of course, we actually want the name to not be equal to John to get entry into our club. So we can use an exclamation mark here, which I didn't actually cover before, but I wanted to save it for this example. So you can use an exclamation mark to say not equal. So you can use this with both the double equals and the triple equals, like this. So this is pretty much going to check if the age is greater than 18 and name is not equal to John. So even if the person is over 18, if his name is equal to John, then he will not get in. So for example, let's go ahead and say the name in this case is Jack or Jane. Now we're going to set the age to 15. Now what I'm going to do is go ahead and run the program and we'll see what happens. So let's go ahead and run. And it says access denied. And this is because even if Jane isn't John, her age is still 15, so she will not be granted entry into our club. So there we go. That's pretty much it for the AND symbol, but there's also another one, which is called OR. So you can use that symbol right there, and pretty much this is going to evaluate to true if one of these are true. So let's go ahead and run this and see what happens. You can say it says an entry granted. Now this is because pretty much our name here, our name of our person, is not John. So pretty much it just completely overrides the age because one of the events is true. So for this, we're strictly sticking to AND because we want both of these conditions to be true here. And of course, it goes to access denied. So there we go. We have our AND and our OR operators. So this is pretty much it for if statements. Of course, this gets a lot more complicated and you have a lot more operators on top of these ones, but this is kind of the basics of writing these if statements. So let's go ahead and move forward. We've covered if statements, now let's go ahead and look at loops. So let's go back to creating our patient names list here. So I'm going to say var patient names is equal to, and we're going to have John, Doe, Jane, and Doe again. So pretty much, let's say we wanted to go and print out every single name here. Now, what would be an efficient way to do this? Because we're not going to go in console.log each individual one. We're not going to go patient name 0, patient names 1, and so forth. We have to find a way to use this and go through and print out each name. And this is where loops come in. Now, pretty much what you can do with loops is go through and kind of run a certain operation or whatever you want to run a specific number of times so you can keep running it through and through without having to write it over and over again. So there are actually two different types of loops, while loops and for loops. We're going to start off with while loops. So what we're going to do is say while, and then in brackets, and then you're going to put some condition. So let's just go ahead and say, we're going to go ahead and set a number here. So I'm going to say var num is equal to 1, or actually 0 in this case. So while num, and we're going to run this a certain number of times. So I'm going to say while num is less than or equal to 10, and we put our curly braces. We are going to console.log num. So let's go ahead and run this and see what happens. If I refresh the page, oh, whoops. Actually, there we go. I meant to highlight that point in a second. But pretty much what this is going to do is continue to run this as long as num is less than or equal to 10. And this is a pretty important point about infinite loops. Now, pretty much you can see that num is equal to 0. Console.log num, it console.logs 0. But nothing actually happens to num. This is just going to continue running and running indefinitely because we're not changing num at all. So that's one thing about infinite loops, because remember, this will always evaluate to true. So let's go ahead and talk about this. How do we change num or sort of move it so that this doesn't happen? What we can do is just add 1 to num every time, and this will eventually stop. Let's go ahead and refresh the page and see what happens. A little bit of a problem there. I'm going to go ahead and open that window again. Now, if we go ahead and open up the console, you can see that it console.logs all the way up to 10. Oh, whoops. Console.logs all the way up to 10. So there we go. We add 1 to num every single time, and it continues running until this is false. And once we get to 11, this is going to turn false. So this doesn't just have to be one condition, although it normally is. You can use just like normal conditionals like you would use in if statements. So that's it for a while loop, but this is pretty inefficient. What if we wanted to have 2 variables incrementing? There's actually another way to use this, and we don't even have to declare a variable up here. What we can do is use something called a for loop. So there are 3 main parts to a for loop. So there's declaration, condition, and incrementation. So pretty much the declaration is where we're going to declare our variable. So I'm going to say our num is equal to 0. So this is our starting value. We want to check the condition on which to run the loop. So I'm going to say as long as num is less than or equal to 10. And then you have your incrementation. So this is what you're going to do with the variable every single time you run through. So in this case, I'm going to say num plus equals 1. And there's actually a special operator you can use for this, and it's called plus plus. So this is if you want to increment it 1 time. So now I'm going to go ahead and create our curly braces just like before. And I'm going to start typing out our code. So I'm going to say console.log num. Let's go ahead and refresh and see what happens. Little error there. Make sure not to put a semicolon at the end. Refresh, and now we get 0 through 10, just like we would before. So you can see that this is much shorter than using a while loop. We don't have to declare any variables or increment through in the loop. All we have to do is put everything up here, and it'll work just like before. Now here's the little exercise for you. How are we supposed to print the names of these patients? So what we're going to do here is actually use num to access it through the index. Var num is equal to 0. Num is less than the length. Now in this case, we're just going to use a hard-coded number, and I'll talk about why you shouldn't do that in a second, but we're going to put 4 there. And then every time, we're going to increment the number. Now what we're going to console.log is patient names of num. And pretty much what this is going to do is take that number and get our name. Let's go ahead and refresh and see what happens. And you can see that we actually get undefined at the end because remember, we're starting at 0, but we're going to end at 4. And remember how our indexes start at 0, so the highest index is 3. So what we actually want to print here is 3. Now let's go ahead and refresh. We remove that undefined value. Now, how do we actually fix this? What are we supposed to do to remove this hard-coded number? Because what if we want to add one more? We're going to miss out on a couple of items. Now, all we have to do is use patientnames.length, as I showed you before, and then subtract 1 from it to get the highest index. We refresh, should give us the exact same thing. So that's pretty much it for loops. This is pretty easy, and you can get a lot of benefit out of using these loops as they are very useful in JavaScript. The last part of this crash course is functions. So functions are probably the most important part of any programming language because you can really optimize how you want to run something. So let's go ahead and say we wanted a scenario where we wanted to print our name 500 times. Now, this would be fine. We could use a loop and just loop through 500 times and print it as normal. But what if we wanted to actually change the name that we wanted to run it with? Now, for example, the first name could be John, the second name could be Doe, and so on. How are we supposed to print that name over and over again while also changing it? Now, this is where functions can come in really handy. Now, of course, printing a name isn't really a hard task to do. It's pretty much a one-liner. But what if you wanted to do something more complicated, like store something to a database or run a complex sorting algorithm? You're not going to run it or just type out what you want to do over and over again, are you? So this is where functions come in. Just like variables store certain values, functions store certain mechanics or lines of code that you can use later on. So functions are found pretty much everywhere. So for example, before our shift and unshift, we had our patient names. And we had unshift like that. That is a function right there. Right there is doing something in the backend where it's it's doing something to the array. That is a function. Now, instead of having to say in our patient names, we want to go and move something, instead, we can just use this simple line to run that code. So let's go ahead and start typing our functions. So the pretty much standard protocol for typing a function is function, which is the keyword, and then the name of your function, which is, for example, print name, and then you put parentheses and curly brackets. So in these curly brackets, you're going to type whatever you want to use for the function. So in this case, I want to just print out a name. For example, the string John Doe. Refresh it, and well, we didn't actually call it. So this is another important part of functions is even though you've defined it, you still need to do something to run the function because this is only the definition. This is only where you go to JavaScript and you say, okay, I have our function here and we've declared it, and then nothing else happens. So the easiest way to run a function is to just type out its name and then put parentheses after it. Now watch what happens if I just use it without parentheses. Nothing actually happens because this just types out the name of the function. This doesn't actually run it. In order to run it, you need to put parentheses after it. After that, you can see it prints John Doe. So the last thing I want to talk about, or the last few things, are parameters and arguments. So let's just say I have our name John Doe here, but what if I wanted to print a different name, like I said before in the example? For example, let's say I wanted to print Jane Doe. Would I just change it? What if I wanted to print John Doe and Jane Doe in the same script? What am I supposed to do then? This is where parameters and arguments come in really handy. So up here in these parentheses, you can actually type out words which can be used as reference points later on in your function. So for example, if I type out name, and in our console.log, I want to log the name, when I am actually calling my function, I can specify what I want that name to be. In this case, John Doe. I refresh, and it works. So if this name is just a placeholder for whatever we're passing in here, up here is the parameter, and here is the argument. So the argument is what you explicitly pass in, and the parameter is in your definition of your function where you're trying to specify the placeholders. So parameters and arguments become very useful, especially in this case if I wanted to print John Doe and Jane Doe in the same script. Using the same function, it'll work perfectly. So the final thing I want to talk about in this video is methods. So methods are pretty much functions that are attached to objects. So I'm going to say profile, var profile. We're going to go back to our username password system. Except in this case, I'm going to give it a username, or a name in this case. And I'm just going to say John Doe. And what I also want to do is give this profile a way to, let's just say hi. So what I want to do is be able to specify the object, in this case our profile, and then something with it is just sort of, for example, I say profile.sayHi, and it's going to do something in our console. So just like keys can store strings, numbers, booleans, we can also store functions. So I'm going to say hi, and then with our colon there is type out this method of a function. So you can see there's no explicit name, and this is because, oops, forgot to put a comma there. This is because it's already being attached to our key. So I'll show you what that means later. So let's go ahead and say hi. What I'm going to say is console.log profile.name. So what this is pretty much going to do is print out the name of the profile. Let's go ahead and run this. So I'm going to say profile.sayHi, put parentheses around it because it's a function. Let's go ahead and refresh the page. It says John Doe. We don't even need to pass anything in here. We can if we wanted to though. So for example, I would go and pass in name. I would say profile.sayHi and then John Doe. And in this case, I'll just show you to illustrate. Jane Doe will give us, oops, forgot to change that. So I console.log name, and it gives us Jane Doe. So that's how you can actually attach functions to our objects. And if you remember, just like with our unshift and shift, those are actually methods that are acting on the object. So that's pretty much it for our JavaScript crash course. Now, there is a lot to learn and a lot to cover, but there's actually a lot more. And this is just kind of the basics. The basics are, the bread and butter of JavaScript. There's so much more that you can do with it, and there's so many more tools that you can use. So for example, if you want to integrate them into your websites, there is a lot more to do. But these are the basics, and this is kind of your stepping stone to future, more advanced JavaScript and in general programming. All right, thanks for watching the crash course.